everyone, and welcome to today's event, Rights and Resistance Commemorating the 20th Anniversary of Legal Same-Sex Marriage in San Francisco. I'm Tina Sachs, Associate Professor of Social Welfare and the Chair of the Center for Research on Social Change, which sponsored this afternoon's event. I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event also, the Othering and Belonging Institute, the Center for the Study of Law and Society, and the Department of Gender and Women's Studies here at UC Berkeley. I also want to thank Maxwell Vanderwalker, our Chief Administrative Officer. In addition to managing the logistics for this event, he has been deeply involved in conceptualizing it, and he designed the beautiful poster. Before we begin the event, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with the university values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and our commitment to hold the university more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Now, I want to take you back in time to 20 years ago, February 2004. At that time, marriage in the United States was restricted to being between a man and a woman. There were no jurisdictions where men could marry men or women could marry women. Though gay rights activists had been fighting for this right at least since the 1970s. The institution of marriage is typically thought of as a cornerstone of American society, and many social benefits flow through marriage, including insurance, tax advantages, child custody, inheritance, and many others. Gay couples could not access these benefits and often couldn't even visit their partners in the hospital. Then, on February 12, 2004, same-sex marriage was suddenly declared legal in San Francisco by Gavin Newsom, who was the mayor at the time. Couples flocked to San Francisco to get married, where they had to face angry protesters. About 4,000 marriage licenses were issued in the span of 4 weeks. And then the California Supreme Court ordered San Francisco to stop issuing licenses. I won't go into all the legal and electoral battles that followed, but achieving marriage equality became the central focus of the gay rights movement. And that was declared legal nationwide in 2015 by the US Supreme Court. While that seemed to settle the matter, many worry now that the case could be overturned. We're currently in a moment of profound homophobia and transphobia in many parts of the United States, with battles over school curriculum, youth sports, bathrooms, and more. This 20-year anniversary gives us the opportunity to pause and reflect on what marriage provides, as well as what the focus on marriage forecloses, as we think of the future of organizing and social change. We've convened a panel of experts to engage in conversation about how the legalization of same-sex marriage changed life for LGBTQ+ communities and how it has intersected with other dimensions of inequality. To save time for our discussion, I will keep my introductions very brief, but you can find more information on our panelists at the event website. Here with us today are Karma Chavez, who is Professor of Mexican American and Latino Studies at UT Austin, Kenyon Farrow, who is a journalist, media strategist, and organizer, Sasha Eisenberg, who is a journalist and author of The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. We also are fortunate to have Priya Kandaswamy, who is a professor of women's studies at San Diego State University, Sophie Lewis, who is the author of Abolish the Family, A Manifesto for Care and Liberation, and Molly McKay Williams, who is an attorney and LGBT rights activist who was married in San Francisco in 2004.
Okay, we will start with a question for the two panelists who were there in 2004, Molly and Priya. Could you each share a memory of that time with us?
I'll start off. That day was incredible because we had been going year after year, and I had my wedding dress on and my game face on, ready to get turned down because that's Freedom to Marry Day. We'd been doing it for years and years. We showed up at the civil marriage license counter to get to show that the discrimination is coming across by the civil government. This has nothing to do with religion. This is like, and we'd get to know the people in line, and the straight couples would be like, "Oh, it's so awful." And so I got there, and then one of the activists ran up to me, and goes, "We're not having a protest today. There's no protest." But he seemed so happy, and I was like, "Do we forget the permit? What happened?" He's like, "Oh," and then just behind him, Dell and Phil, who of course everyone knows, they're like from the 1950s. They founded the Daughters of Bilitis, came out
Yeah.
grinning ear to ear, matching pantsuits, marriage license in hand, and he said, "They're marrying us today." And my head went boom, and it was like my heart went boom, and it was like I was holding in my hand, and this would be my memory. I was holding in my hand something I was going to use at the rally. And it was a quote by Muhammad Ali. And it's that impossible is a big word thrown around by small men who find it easier to live in the world they've been given than to explore the power they have to change it. Impossible is not a fact, it's an opinion. Impossible is not a declaration, it's a dare. Impossible is potential. Impossible is temporary. Impossible is nothing. And it just felt like I mean,
Wow.
I had no idea how powerful and how true that would ring, and it just went from the wall being there, and we thought maybe in our lifetime we'd see it, to, like, it happening right then and there, and everyone just started pouring down from like, they would, like, take their kids, or at, like, had friends at Toys R Us, they had just picked up their children and ran down, and people from all over the place, and for Sacramento were coming in, it just became everyone was getting married, the whole entire rotunda was filling up with couples. People were like, strangers became like best friends, standing into each other's witnesses. Everyone was in regular clothes practically, and it was like this outpouring of love that went on for an entire month,
Yeah.
nonstop. It was so magical, and straight people were sending things like pizza and Dunkin' Donuts, and people were overnight in the storm and rain, and it was like, if this does not show our common humanity and our love.
Okay, Priya, please share a memory.
I mean, my memory of that time is really different. I lived in Oakland. I was a grad student at Berkeley at the time, and I did not get married, though many people around me did. And the thing that I was thinking about today, thinking about this question, was the experience of walking into my graduate seminar in gender and women's studies, which is a place where you expect there to be some sort of critique of marriage happening. And like everyone had gotten married over the weekend, and that there was a lot of like and people can like asked me, and I felt like in that month people asked me and my partner many times if we had gotten married, and that
And were you philosophically, ideologically anti-marriage?
I mean, I was very critical of, I mean, I'm critical of the institution of marriage in
Yeah.
general, and critical of kind of the political turn towards gay marriage. So I think that there's an interesting thing happening about how what the state makes available. And I do think, right, like that my memory of that time was that there was just this like very like strong discourse about like marriage being really wonderful, and a really yeah, a really concerted effort to silence people.
Yeah, and did you feel betrayed? Did you feel that the rug had been pulled from under you by people who were your allies?
Felt betrayed, but I did feel surprised, right?
Yeah.
That so many people would be so excited about
Mhm.
marriage as an institution, particularly
Yeah.
people who generally had left politics.
Um,
To me, that felt surprising.
Before we move on, Molly and Priya were the only ones actually there in 2004. But would anyone else want to weigh in with an observation from February 2004 before we move on?
I'll go next, and it's probably more in line with Priya's recollection. So at the time, I was living in New Orleans, actually working for Critical Resistance, and I was in Atlanta probably about a week or so after the California decision, and I remember walking past the Atlanta Journal Constitution like on a Sunday. I was like out. This is, even 20 years ago when there were actual print newspapers around. So it was either in the lobby of my hotel or someplace I was walking, but there were stacks of like
Yeah.
the Sunday Atlanta Journal Constitution. And what was, and so just a few months prior to that was Massachusetts, and then California happened. The Sunday edition of the Atlanta Journal Constitution, the front page was a picture of a white gay couple and then a black, cisgender heterosexual Christian couple, right? And the article was very much framed as like, there's Black people are opposed to gay marriage, right? And this juxtaposition of who was seen as the sort of proponents of same-sex marriage and who was seen as like the opposition. Striking at that point, and so much of what happened after that flowed with a very kind of racialized dynamic about the conversation about same-sex marriage, through largely which like Black queer people were just completely ignored in the debate, right? So there was a level of that to me that and part of how I started to respond to the issue was starting to see the way that was playing out in the press.
Has anyone on this panel looked into the racial makeup of the people who were married during that month, and if it roughly aligned with the SF Bay Area?
There's one more thing I would just add
Go
while
ahead,
we're
Sasha.
sort of thinking back on what happened then. Obviously, San Francisco was the focal point of all this, and more people were married there in February 2004 than anywhere else. But it set in motion interest by a number of local politicians around the country over the subsequent weeks. Sandoval County, New Mexico, Multnomah County commissioners in Portland, Oregon. I think it was the mayor of New Paltz, New York. There were a handful of local governments where, sort of analogous to what city government in San Francisco did, in apparent defiance of state law, began marrying couples. And I think it was the combination of those factors nationally, all these sort of local explosions of marriages of sort of dubious legality, that certainly the right took as reason to mobilize in a new way, and that's what led George W. Bush to endorse the federal marriage amendment later in February. So this wouldn't have happened without San Francisco, but if it had happened only in San Francisco, the national political dynamic around same-sex marriage might have looked a bit different.
Let's focus on some phrases you just used. You said apparent defiance of state law and marriages of dubious legality. Marriages always felt like more of a gesture or a statement of intent than actually a legal maneuver. Who wants to jump in?
I want to dominate, but I do want to just mention that it was, when it first went down, this was before people had formed. I think the Proposition 8, what Kenyon was talking about, definitely played out in the Prop 8 debate, and it was definitely it felt very intentionally divisive.
Could you give us a quick primer on what Prop 8 was?
So after the California Supreme Court, after many ups and downs, legalized marriage for same-sex couples, 6 months later, the state of California, while we were electing President Obama, voted by a pretty short, it wasn't a big landslide, but we lost Proposition 8 and therefore lost the ability to continue to marry until the court case came around. But during the time period before money poured in and sides were drawn, just during that original time, which is really what I don't want it to get lost in this 20-year anniversary. And I do think there's fair critiques to be made, and we should make them about the campaigns, about marriage in general. But I don't want to forget that this is also a moment to celebrate, because it was like this huge burden of homophobia, this wall that felt impenetrable, this ability to express our love and to be recognized as uncles and aunts, and sewn into the family quilt for the first time. A lot of people were like, come in the military, coming in and serving our country, and for the first time being able to say, spouses for life. We had couples together for 50 to 60 years coming forward as saying, and it was again, I didn't do the statistics, but it was San Francisco, and San Francisco is incredibly diverse. And I just want to point out that it was really, it felt extremely representative of the city, and I just wanted.
Karma and Sophie, what did this month look like to you in hindsight? What did it look like to you if you were paying attention then?
And I was a graduate student at Arizona State at the time, and a sort of very righteous anti-marriage, anti-military, anti-hate crime queer activist and scholar. And part of that was, to build a little bit on what Priya and Kenyon were saying, is like my alliance with poor queer communities, immigrant queer communities. And, at the time I was in Arizona, and I was preoccupied with the over 140 anti-immigrant bills that had been introduced in the state of Arizona that year, and in previous years, several as well. And so I can remember when this happened, and I was, with a group of also angry queer friends, and we were, just sort of lamenting all of the money that was going into what, in our view, was the happiness of mostly white, very gender normative, gay, not queer people, who were going to have access to wealth and their partner's health insurance because they had it, and all the other things that the people that we knew and we were in alliance with didn't have access to, and frankly wouldn't have access to even if they married. And so I remember, and I guess I still feel very cynical about the whole occasion.
Sophie, what about you?
Afraid, same, um I actually, I was elsewhere in Europe. I remember being quite struck by the outpouring of celebration and emotion, and I wasn't unmoved by it. um uh I write about abolition of the family, and I found that people don't invite me to their weddings because they assume I wouldn't want to come. That's the one good part, right? Like, I mean, not always, but there are some, I did it. I did it. I need a green card. I mean, I also have this kind of, contrarian stance where I kind of want to suggest that all marriages are green cards in a sense, I mean, I threw a party. It upset my partner's parents because it was a pretty, anti-marriage ceremony where we vowed not to make vows and things like that, right? Anyway, this isn't really answering your question. I think I think how I felt then was a little bit baffled. I was moved sort of by proxy sometimes, but I felt very much not part of the movement that would fight specifically for this thing. I felt very you know disconnected from the people saying this was the fight of our lives, speaking for queer people.
Sasha, the person who wrote the book about this, did you see it as legal, political, a combination? When you look historically at this, the title of your book says the 25-year fight. Where did this event fit in?
This was political by definition. It was politicians making a decision, not, I mean, the city attorney was behind this, so it wasn't done without sort of, some sense that they could make arguments in court to defend it. But in every instance, it was people who are part of the political institutions of our government making a decision about policy at, as you mentioned, this is not something that mayors or county executives have ever in American history been sort of empowered to change the qualifications. In California in 2000, voters, with by a 2-to-1 margin, passed a ballot measure that defined marriage between a man and a woman. So it was pretty clear what the law in California was when Gavin Newsom basically ordered his city attorney and clerk to figure out how to do this. And so they did. They tried to defend their actions by claiming that that 2000 law was unconstitutional, and they ended up prevailing at the court. But at the time, it was pretty clearly beyond what a city hall should be doing, and they were acting politically.
Kenyon, you were talking about the framing of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but in terms of the impact of this movement on the LGBTQ plus rights agenda at large, what do you make of it? What do you think of it?
It certainly had impact on the movement. But what was, I think, something that Karma kind of stated, that part of my response was also looking at the way in which, kind of resources were being moved to the exclusion of pretty much everything else at the time. And a lot of queer activists, particularly, trans folks and queer folks of color, being told that, this is it, right? And you kind of either have to get with this, or, I mean, I literally, Matt Foreman at Creating Change around, I think, 2003, so just prior to this, said to the room about gay marriage, you're either with us or against us, right? And that kind of set the tone. And then I think, so I just think part of what we have to actually kind of grapple with is that, like, there are multiple kind of realities based on who you are in this country and in this world and how things. So there's a kind of meta narrative that happens, which is the one that, often, that gets the histories and the PBS documentaries and all the other things about, how, kind of celebratory and ever it was. But there were a lot of folks who were really asking, well, to what end, and what are we, kind of giving up? And I'll give one example. Around that time, I know there was a call of some national LGBT organizations around the time when the CDC had released a study showing, particularly that gay, cis gay men were still disproportionately impacted by the HIV epidemic in this country. And certainly that was true of, and it's true of Black gay men more than anybody. And having folks in some national organizations say to me and other people on this call that we don't want y'all to do any sort of media or press or make a big sort of national deal out of this data, because the way we have framed the gay marriage movement to sort of present itself as kind of was said, the kind of well-fed, well-scrubbed, kind of middle class, mostly white gays and lesbians, that to talk about the AIDS epidemic still being something that impacts our community, one, brings up the question of sex, right? Brings up the question of the HIV epidemic, and that the movement was making a very strategic, I was literally told this on the call by national organizations, we were making a strategic decision to move away from those issues. Meanwhile, we're in 2024, and in 2018, the CDC released a study saying that if current trends continue, Black gay and bisexual men, 1 in 2 Black gay and bisexual men may become HIV positive in their lifetimes, right? And so that was the impact of what happened and resources moved, conversations moved, and there was no coming back for any of the other things that some of us were working on, like HIV, like housing and homelessness for queer young folks, stuff for queer immigrants, and et cetera.
So much of the critique in the moment was grounded in a deep sense of uncertainty, like, will this make a backlash? Will this leave our trans brothers and sisters by the wayside? Will we lose in the Supreme Court? There were so many unknowns as people were debating this in real time in 2004. With 20 years of hindsight, has anything changed anyone's mind on this panel, or do you still pretty much feel the same way that you did in 2004?
I spent some time looking at some of the intense and powerful scholarship of some of the other on the panel. So as a marriage equality advocate, I read through it and I was moved, and I was like, yeah, I was glad to be on a panel where this critique is coming forward. It's important. It's a piece of it as well. And it is the part that can get eclipsed in the process, and it needs to be brought back to the forefront. It's like, there's choices that get made. There's monolithic, it was never my organization. I was with Marriage Equality California. We never had any money. We only just had like grassroots organizations and volunteers. But I know what people are talking about when you're talking about the HRCs and the big money organizations, that once we were not the ones pushing marriage until some of the people like Gavin Newsom stepped forward and made it seem possible. I mean, in fact, they were the ones that were telling me that I was like, get out of your wedding dress. You look ridiculous. This is not going to happen in your lifetime. Maybe we'll get ENDA passed if you sit down and be quiet, these kind of things. And we're like, what I would always argue before it became even vogue to be a marriage equality activist, which I'll tell you, it has not always been that way. I would say, it strikes at the very heart of homophobia, the very heart. It's who we love. And we're not given access and seen as worthy. There's no way for our relationships, no matter how long we're together, to be recognized within the larger family context structure. Now, I know that we can critique that larger family structure, and we should, but it's almost like we were never even on the inside. Like, we don't, at least now we have the right to exercise the choice. Like what Priya was saying, it's like, until there was the opportunity to get married, we as queer people never had the chance to exercise that or not. We were categorically excluded. And certainly it has not been the end all be all, but I would say it has done a lot to drive a dagger right in the heart of homophobia, because our love is valid, equal, recognized, doesn't need a separate name, gives people access to health benefits, tangible things like you can be. It has a safety net feature for people that, in fact, some of the people who, especially if they're in an economically diverse relationship, in the past, the one that had the money would leave, and the person that was left behind got no matter how long they'd been together, they got none of the money. It was totally unfair. The non-biological parent would lose any chance they'd ever see their kid again. I mean, there were like some real tangible immediate benefits, 1,138, hundreds of state rights that immediately came with marriage. And I'm not saying that marriage is perfect, but as gay people, we don't destroy, we renovate. So we're already making it, like pushing it in the right direction to keep it relevant and technicolor, but there is still a long way to go, and there's lots more to be done. And it's certainly, the critiques that are made are, I don't mean to be in opposition to them, I'm not.
Who wants to respond to that?
I kind of just want to jump in really quickly and say a couple of things about that. Like, I mean, I think this idea that it strikes at the heart of homophobia is interesting, but I see it really differently, right? Like, I just and then actually, I really think that it's not actually homophobia that is the problem, right? Like, I would frame the problem differently, and I think that this is actually part of the tension around marriage. Like, I actually think we live in a society that is structured by interlocking structures of domination that cannot be separated, right? And that like we can't actually take homophobia out of racism and capitalism and other forms of nationalism and anti-immigrant, like that all of these things are really imbricated in each other, and that to say that like the goal is to strike at the heart of homophobia, like to me, I feel like that's neglecting the ways that heteronormativity actually links all of these different structures together. And so, for example, like when we talk about the rights garnered through marriage, right? And this was a big argument for marriage equality at the time, and it is significant and impacts a lot of people's lives. But I do think that part of what was challenging, or what has been challenging as gay marriage has become solidified, is that it really separates lesbian and gay, like what gets termed as mainstream lesbian gay issues, from other social justice issues. So for example, instead of talking about, national health care as a queer issue, we talk about rights to our partner's health care through marriage. Or instead of talking about like the numerous ways that the state takes Black and brown people's children from them, we think about, right, how do I secure rights of my children through marriage, right? Like that it would be more like we would be more successful in movement organizing if we were working to make articulations with all of the different ways that people are negatively impacted by a lot of these institutions, rather than trying to like separate out, right, marriage as a solution to homophobia, but rather really thinking more broadly about all of the different ways that people are negatively impacted by a lot of like the very valid issues I think that you're naming.
Karma, it looked like you had something to say.
I mean, pretty much covered it. I was just gonna say, I mean, I think one of the challenges is that yes, for those who conform to what it means to be a good American on every measure, except for the fact that they're gay, marriage is a boon, but that doesn't incorporate, a huge swath of both gay and straight people. Marriage actually doesn't work for most people. Even if you can, have access to your partner's wealth, for example, if your partner has no wealth, that doesn't matter. If your partner has no health insurance, it doesn't matter. And that's the reality for the vast majority of people. And so just to, build on Priya's point, it's like, why were our energies not put toward how we could create infrastructures of care and safety for more people, as opposed to reinforcing structures for the most privileged?
Sasha, it looked like you had something to say.
I mean, I think I just want to give voice to what was a sort of not an ideological critique like the ones we've heard here of what happened but a sort of very practical one of what happened in February 2004, which gets back to that question of the legality. And I think that I've heard it said that Gavin Newsom and San Francisco city government raised people's expectations by conveying that these were marriage licenses that were going to be legal forever. Hope everybody that went through the experience had that sense of awareness, but I think that there was some expectation that here was a government saying, we are recognizing your relationship, you are celebrating this lifelong commitment that will now have the backing of the state, well aware that that might last only hours, days, of eventually it was weeks. And so that's something that I think hangs over this experience. We talk about how it looks in hindsight, but I think that there were almost certainly some people who found themselves disappointed by government because they did not actually realize that this was a form of protest by a chief executive, but this was, read this as actually, the regular order of business by a government doing what it was empowered to do.
Molly, did that feel like a blow to you when marriages were annulled?
I mean, again, I was in it for the long haul and whatever would happen. I remember being on Fox News like a couple hours later. They're like, grab that when she got married, bring her in down. And I was on this panel with all these horrible right-wing people, and they were just saying the meanest things like, "Oh, your wedding, your marriage licenses is worth my used toilet paper." And I was like, you know what? I think there was a moment where I was like, really? Like, do you think that's okay to say to someone that just got married? Who are you? Like, what you are? That is the most mean-spirited thing I've ever heard said. Like, what is wrong with you? This is the happiest day of my life. And I know how people are like, blah, on this panel, but it did really feel amazing to be able to have that license. And I knew we'd have to fight for it. I knew it wouldn't be, that was too easy. That's not over. But I think it gave us an opportunity to go to fair-minded people, good-hearted people that didn't know that they knew a gay or lesbian person and a queer person in their life. And they got to see it up close, and they got to be a part of it. They got invited to weddings. They got to, it created a lot of people coming in as allies on our side. And I'd say the same thing happened when we lost Prop 8. I think a lot of people were so surprised and shocked. They're like, I didn't even think I had to work on that in California. And, it knit us together in, it got a lot of allies. It brought people in. I would talk to young queer kids. It'd be like, my mom, who like kicked me out when I was younger, is now dreaming of like dancing at my wedding. And I do know I'm speaking into a narrative, and I'm looking at all of your faces and realizing there's a critique to be made for that. There is, but there's a part of like, it's a very human institution. It's the way in which a lot of our society sees how happily ever afters can go and people can be in love together. And for so many years and decades, as queer people, we were like, you don't get that. Like my mom said, why would you ever choose that lonely, terrible lifestyle? And I'm like, when we were the grand marshals of the parade a couple years later, my mom's in the car like Queen Mom. I'm like, oh, Mom. And there's a million people cheering. I'm like, such a lonely, terrible life, right? And she's like, I was wrong. I'm sorry. So that did happen. And I think that moved us forward a bit. And, it brought a lot of people and heart to the movement. I know that's hard to talk about in quantifiable terms, but it mattered. I can't say, I'm a lawyer, and it was the legalities didn't matter. It was a heart moment. I feel like people got the light bulb turned on.
Let's move to the present day before we get to audience questions. Right now, we are seeing this moment where politicians are accusing queer people of grooming. There's a huge legal movement against trans people and nonconformity generally. How do you relate the backlash that we are seeing today to the fight for marriage equality we saw beginning to unfold 20 years ago?
I would say that I think that some of it is about the backlash that we see now. Some of it is about a backlash to same-sex marriage. I make no bones about the fact that, kind of Christian right-wing, forces in the country, definitely fought to see, this institution as, strictly for, cisgender heterosexual couples. But I think that opposition had been there, and that had been, and so that just became kind of one way to sort of hang, one issue to sort of hang the homophobia onto. But I personally think that, that we just have had a trajectory of of various kinds of like homophobia and transphobia in the United States. And that just became kind of the backlash um, is a part of a longer trajectory that isn't just about marriage. I think that to me, we make a mistake in that, right? And that's part of what we're seeing in these other things that have nothing to do with gay marriage, but, you know, about, you know, trans folks being able to use public restrooms, or about even to me, the debates about the wedding cakes and stuff is fundamentally actually to me not about, and I'm not a lawyer, but I am Black and know enough about the civil rights movement and know that the right wing has been trying to undermine the Civil Rights Act and the public accommodations sort of clauses within it. So this becomes a strategy to do that, right? So to me, the homophobia is there. I don't see it as just a backlash against same-sex marriage. I see it as part of a longer trajectory that's about, you know, other sort of just like control of people's bodies and relationships, through which queer people are a piece of, but has a much wider kind of agenda, and some of which we're seeing play out, you know, within, and the fact that all these things are happening at the same time, the anti-trans bills, the pushback against abortion rights for women, the case that I'm following, given my work in HIV, on that may upend, you know, PrEP access, you know, the HIV prevention pill, which may also translate into treatment. So if you create a situation where the Supreme Court decides that if this ends up happening this year, that, you know, providers don't have to provide, you know, PrEP, you know, to patients. There's nothing to say that they couldn't do that for people living with HIV for treatment, that there's some, you know, which goes beyond even just an attack on queer folks. So
Let me give the rest of the panel a chance to weigh in on this. How do you relate the anti-LGBTQ legislation and rhetoric that we see today to that same-sex marriage movement from 20 years ago?
I see it less as a matter of backlash, as a sort of redirection of the anti-LGBT rights sort of capacity, sort of more of a supply side explanation. I think a version of what Kenyon described happening among activists on the left. Sorry. It's my heteronormative traditional family acting out again. This became the organizing principle of religious conservatives. I think you could see the origins of that not in 2004, but in the backlash to the Hawaii court decision in 1993 that led to the Defense of Marriage Act in 96. And you have examples of conservative activists saying this animates our base, you know, in a way that at that point displaced abortion as the kind of organizing issue of their time. It became the thing that brought groups together across some pretty significant lines. You know, you look at 2000 in California, 2008, you have coalitions that are built with Catholics, evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants, and Mormons working together, which bridges a number of like political and doctrinal differences that are pretty significant. And so what you had up until the certainly the Windsor case of 2013 was some sense that this was the dominant issue for religious conservatives to get behind. And they realized after the Windsor decision in 2013 that they were going to lose the big fight sooner or later. And what happened almost immediately was a redirection of the resources that had been going to fight over marriage laws, state and federally, towards other issues that previously had been farther down their list of concerns. And trans-related gender identity stuff is high there. You saw a redirection of resources that had been spent domestically in the U.S. going to fight overseas, especially in parts of Africa, to maintain or advance anti-gay laws there. And you see some of the capacity that's going into fighting, you know, over book bans and restrictions on teaching, which is a real throwback to sort of the Briggs Initiative era. Those resources would have been fighting for marriage if that fight were still going on. And I think it's really, I don't see it as a backlash to the decision, but I just think that there's, you know, each side has a limited number of resources, and what happens ultimately is they can only fight over so many things.
The conversation is not over, but before we go to audience questions, does anyone want a final word on this?
I just wanted to say, like, I think that like future looking, right? Like
Yeah.
what is, and I like this reframing of a redirection of resources more than a backlash. Like that there is this like predicament in contemporary politics, like when you think about like something like the Roe decision is something that there are good reasons to protect, but also was very inadequate to begin with in terms of protecting people's actual access to abortion. And so like I think that like when we think about a lot of these questions, right, in the current moment, right, like how do we actually in this moment not just be reactive to a lot of like assaultive legislation, but like still keep an eye on what we actually want or like what is actually going to improve the lives of, you know, like not just gay people, but like working class people, queer people, trans people, people of color, right? Like across the board and much more sort of immigrants, right? Like a much more expansive way. Like how do we continue to do that and not just end up in a reactive stance?
I mean, I see so much really strange, sort of symptomatic marriage propaganda. The New York Times sort of enjoins people to you know, save the institution of marriage every other week, it seems to me, in op-eds. And I think we should be curious about the economic, you know, politics of that, and on, you know, the need to sort of you know, re-privatize care and the links between this kind of thing and a history of austerity. I mean, I would also see gay marriage as a campaign that's this is a materialist, not an ideological critique, actually, of you know, as a sort of counter revolution against a moment of you know, left queer politics that around the time of the sort of AIDS catastrophe and the movements, you know, it galvanized, we're beginning to, you know, question the idea of, you know, healthcare only for some, or healthcare via private channels, healthcare, you know, mediated via employers and via marriage for that reason. And I think in a sense it was counter-revolutionary and, you know, a real missed opportunity. There was a reason why you know, gay liberation era, women's liberation, children's liberation era, you know, queers called those who were interested in the sort of, you know, the path into private property and, you know, the touch of the state. They called them straight gays, right? I mean, this isn't simply a smear. This is an economic argument, you know, about the world we want to create, where care is deprivatized, and, you know, your means of flourishing are not determined by the happenstance of who you love or whose family you're born into.
I think that the attack, and it is truly a terrifying attack that our queer mobilized, we and our allies need to be really against. But I think that this is the last dying knell of the patriarchy, because they're driving at the difference between men and women and the discomfort that comes around with it being breaking the binary, which more and more is breaking the binary. Women are becoming equal. We're becoming, you know, the number of people entering law school, med school, again, you know, like the positions of power, the CEOs, et cetera. It's not in Congress yet, but making progress. It seems to me that they're getting towards the whole, I think we're still winning forward, even though it sometimes feels like we aren't. I think they've moved off of marriage because we've won. And I still think that is a win for us moving forward in terms of us being equal. And now it's really about gender dynamics, gender politics, and it's a feminist issue as much of anything.
Let's turn to the questions and comments from the audience. We'll start with something one of our viewers said, which is, I own the only gay San Francisco limousine service since 1984. I drove Dylan Phyllis to City Hall that day. I also attended Stonewall in 1969. Don, I hope someone has recorded an oral history from you. It's great to have you here. Now to turn to questions, one participant asks, I was very young in 2004. I would love to hear from those of you who were part of these early movements, if polyamory and non-monogamy and disability rights were part of the marriage equality conversation back then.
Well, I don't know how early. I'm feeling a little old by that question, but but I'll do my best. Well, so part of a discussion that was happening at the time, so in this 20 years ago, that I was very much a part of, and in some ways led by organization that is no longer with us, that I was also a staff member of, which is Queers for Economic Justice, based in New York City. And a big part of Queers for Economic Justice work was really doing organizing, LGBT folks in the New York City shelter system, and also organizing poor and low income LGBT folks in New York City. But we kind of had a national presence because, we really stepped out as an organization that was critical of the same-sex marriage movement. And part of what we did at the time was to bring some folks together to um, create what became a document that you can still find online called Beyond Marriage. And this is where a lot of the critiques, at least from the folks, myself included, who were part of that work, were raising questions about whose family gets to count, right? So, which would include questions of poly couple, or poly families, poly structured relationships. Also, there was a lot of folks from the disability justice, queer folks who either living with disabilities or from the disability justice movement, who were part of those conversations, which were also about, kind of Sophie's point, of their perspective was a lot around the sort of privatization of care that like marriage confers, that often leaves people with disabilities out of those sort of kind of care paradigms. So there was a lot of discussion at the time, and in fact, when you get to the Obama administration, there were a number of people who had signed on to our Beyond Marriage statement who were then up for jobs that had to, be approved through Congress in the Obama administration. Several of those people got in touch with us and tried to take their names off the document because they were trying to, go through that process.
Did it get any of them in trouble? Did the document come up?
In the congressional record. It came up in several of those confirmation interviews. And the thing that the right was stuck on, which was not actually, most of what they asked questions about the Beyond Marriage statement had little to do with gay and lesbian couples, but it was the question of poly couples was the thing that they kind of raised the most, right?
I remember vividly people saying, oh, you're allowing same-sex marriage, so what's next? You're going to allow 3 people to get married? Like, that was a talking point that was everywhere.
And also, to close, a part of what we were trying to leverage within the Beyond Marriage statement is just to say, like, we understand that, like, legally and through policy and a range of things, that different kinds of families need various kinds of protection in the state, from the state. And so, if we were to think about, households or just relationships of care as a framework to think about how to structure policy, so that whatever you do, so whether you get married or not, like my opinion was always this, like if you can get married and it can be treated like a bar mitzvah or a birthday party or whatever, but when it comes down to what the state confers, that should be relationship neutral, so people can just sign a document or say this is who my family is. So that could be a gay couple, straight couple, it could be poly couple, it could be the Golden Girls, right? Like that's a household, right, that has little legal protections in the way that we think. And more Americans are living in scenarios where they're not living in just sort of married couples or in nuclear family structures. And we're seeing so many stories about people aging and living in communities that are non-biological, and we have we could have actually probably gotten to this point sooner had we actually expanded what we were thinking about, as opposed to just solely focused on same-sex marriages.
Maureen Egger asks, I am a sociologist who studies public opinion or attitudinal change. There's not a lot of empirical evidence of large-scale shifts in public opinion or significant within-person attitudinal change during adulthood across a variety of socio-political issues. Attitudes regarding LGBTQ+ issues are an outlier in this regard, in that they have shifted to be much more positive. There could be a number of explanations for this attitudinal change. My question for the panel is if not marriage equality? What are some of the other potential explanations for this change?
I just want to jump on that because I think marriage equality absolutely probably explains that. And I think the reason it explains that is because of the images that have been put forth in the media about who gay people are. They're very gender conforming. They're often very affluent or middle class. They're professional in a certain way. They're monogamous, right? So there are all these images that are the predominant images out there. And that has been largely as a result of marriage equality. And I think that people are comfortable with that. But, you know, some of the issues that, you know, Kenyan's talking about, if we want to talk about, you know, bisexual Black men who are non-monogamous and who might be HIV positive, or if we want to talk about trans women of color who are absolutely killed disproportionately and have not benefited from gay marriage, those are the images that I suspect people haven't really changed their views on. And so I think we would have to dig in a little bit to that research to actually find out what LGBT means in that context.
What's the cost-benefit analysis of attitudes towards LGBTQ plus people moving in a positive direction against the possibly distorted, sanitized, incomplete picture that is presented to the American public of who LGBTQ plus people actually are? Like, there's that cost-benefit trade-off, or is it pure cost?
Well, it's cost for who is what I would say. It's like it's for some people there's a big benefit, but I think that in part of that, if you're just like me except for the gay thing, right, then that is something I think people can get alongside with. I think the movement has been very successful in making that argument about a certain kind of LGB person. Let's leave the T out of it for a second. And so I think that the benefit has been great for those folks. I think the costs, though, on the other hand, has probably been equally as great, if not worse.
This has been a point of tension since the very beginning of the gay rights movement. In the 1950s, Harry Hay in Los Angeles started a chapter of the Mattachine Society that he was later kicked out of because he was a communist and the people who were in charge after him wanted to be more mainstream. This has been a tension point since day one. Priya, let's go to you.
I was just like to just reiterate what Karma is saying. Like, I think that it also has to be noted that like when we say, look, I'm just like you, I belong, there is also a distancing and a reinforcing, right, of other kinds of structural hierarchies. And so part of like why that is dangerous is that it continue, right? Like, so for example, when people like praise like marriage as a marker of like good citizenship, like that actually reinforces like discourses about like low income single mothers as somehow socially degenerate and unworthy of public assistance, um, because it is saying that like the thing that makes me right like good or valuable or part of the polity is that like I adhere to these norms around marriage, right? So I think it is important to also think about the ways in which people vying for inclusion are also reinforcing the exclusions of other people.
Let's move on to another question from the audience. Can you elaborate more on what you were referring to, Sophie, with the New York Times talking about the sanctity of marriage?
Oh gosh, yeah, I typed a long answer. Sure. I think there is a lot of sort of general campaigning for the salvation of marriage going on right now in the across the board in the liberal press as well. I find it interesting because marriage is the one way you can argue perhaps that the private household is somehow in danger. It's very important, I think, transhistorically for nation states and the sort of civil society that protects any given nation state to be able to argue that the family is in crisis. This goes back to antiquity, right? There's never a time that you can ever point to where there's not people saying, "Oh, but kids these days they're not founding, proper marital households," right? But it's true, marriage numbers are declining. But in every other sense, people are more dependent, I think, in 2024 on the private nuclear household and the legal family than ever in recent memory. I think yeah, I think to me it's pretty obvious that there's a massive bias in favor of marriage coming. It's just assumed, I think, if you listen to Ezra Klein talking to Erica Bakioki, the pro-life feminist co-architect of the destruction of Roe versus Wade, that we really need to figure out how to get people marrying. And I just don't get that assumption. I think it's completely alien to me, this assumption that it is in and of itself desirable, and I think gay marriage was a huge, it was in itself a rescue operation for an institution that was taking a battering from the left during the long 60s. And I find it quite counterintuitive that we would even sort of think about anti-trans moral panic right now as a backlash to gay marriage, I have to say, because it seems to me gay marriage is incredibly sort of, repronormative and nationalist in its logic. It seems to me to please the people who we're implicitly talking about here. And I actually also find it incredibly counterintuitive to think that gay marriage is somehow a way of combating homophobia. I would actually say quite the reverse. I find it, I come partly, as you can tell from my accent, or I'm associated with Turf Island, where the number of, conservative, queer-phobic, gay, and lesbian sort of pundits and political forces is perhaps more obvious, I guess. I don't know, but the way in which a sort of queer-phobic, sort of anti-degenerate sort of politics from the right can operate from a place of pro-marriage equality is really intuitive to me, and I don't think there's anything at all there that would combat homophobia per se. Maybe homophobia in a very limited sense in racial and class terms, but certainly not queer phobia. People have argued for decades for a separation between marriage and the state. In that sense, queer people have always gotten married. We can continue getting married. We, in our own terms, the common law marriage tradition. It's just, to me, very strange that queer people of all people, that the word having arisen as a challenge to private property, being a force that would be sort of defanged and co-opted by bringing it into this contract with the state that in its own history was a colonial mechanism, particularly in this Puritan settler colony. The household was considered an arm of the government. Yeah.
Let me jump to something Maxwell Vanderwarker asked, because he put so much work putting this together. Thank you so much. It is much appreciated. He says, as an anecdote, I was a young teen in 2004 living in Kansas, so hearing about queer folks getting married in San Francisco was pretty incredible for me. For a brief moment, I got to feel a little bit less weird, as what felt like the one queer brown kid in the Bible Belt. Even though it didn't change my daily reality at that time, in 2004 it really did feel revolutionary. When I think about the present and the future and Prop 8 and the work done to overturn it, I wonder if it's possible to move any kind of that same energy to trans issues now. On the rare occasion that I am in Kansas now, being a somewhat normative-looking queer man tends not to be an issue, but it's much different when I think about being trans in Kansas, the scrutiny of using bathrooms, the trauma of TSA pat-downs, etc., with more and more TERFs of all varieties, including LGB ones. I wonder how we can mobilize any type of queer coalition to support trans people. Is it possible? What would it look like? Do trans rights begin and end at bathrooms? And our employment, healthcare needs, etc. all fall to the back burner? What do you all think?
It's a great question. I would say this, that I think that, and based on where I am, so I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, and where we just passed some really terrible bills, particularly targeting trans young people. But I would say that what I see here is the thing that people who are not queer or trans, for that matter, seem to respond to is this idea of like the state getting to make these kinds of decisions for, people and their, families and loved ones. That does seem to um has animated some level of pushback from people, as one sort of component. I think we obviously have a long way to go. The other place I sort of see it is um in yeah, I feel well, I'll just say this. I feel like some of what's happened is some of the kind of framing, just from a straight like political kind of policy advocacy standpoint, is like the sort of state overreach and state intrusion in people's lives. It is because it actually buttresses against like what the right says that they're trying to do, which is to take the state out of people's lives. And so that has seemed to work in some ways to get people to think about what's really happening. But and the other thing there's the other thing I was going to say is that seeing some of these cases where, I think questioning the sort of, as much as we use the term cisgender, right, which is a term I don't like for lots of reasons, but I think that I think some of the spaces where I've seen is to question the notion of gender congruence, even for people who are quote unquote term cisgender. So when you see women being, cis quote unquote women being murdered because they were assumed to be trans, or coaches or parents wanting a physical genital inspection of young people playing sports because they think that this person is too tall, too big, too muscular, or whatever. Those do seem to be some things that have been helpful, I think, in it kind of helping unpack this. But I think we have a long way to go, obviously.
Let's zero in on one narrow question within what Maxwell said, which is just setting aside the theory, the ideological argument, the philosophical underpinning of these battles. He asks, I wonder if it's possible to move some of that same kind of energy, like the overturning of Prop 8, and turn it to trans issues.
Steve, what I would offer is what I think really made the difference was in the marriage equality movement was a grassroots organizing force. And there is no shortcut. It is telling your story. It's telling your truth. It's being bold. It's being brave. It's being courageous. It's coming out as a trans person and going out and talking to all different kind of places you can possibly get your hands in, telling your story. And I think that we, with the rest of the LGB, need to really sit back and amplify those voices and stand in solidarity and stand in allyship. And for example, in our own family, so my daughter, her grandparents are trans. We have a transgender lesbian couple, and we are out in Sephora. But God, because these 10-year-olds all want face cream or whatnot, and there's 10-year-old girls looking at our grandparents saying, "Oh, there's a man buying makeup," and I said, no, that's actually Mackenzie's grandmother. And isn't she look beautiful? And she likes the same thing you guys look. You're looking at the same stuff. And just be standing up and allyship. When someone misgenders someone, speaking up and saying something and being an ally. I think it takes both things. Telling our personal stories, and as trans people, I think that's what made the difference with telling our marriage equality stories, is shouldn't be about like this important pricey transgender lesbian that one or two people out in the media. It has to be at the local level, like who owns a local coffee shop, who have you met as a coworker, and then really developing your allyship. I mean, that would be my recommendation and this in the way forward. And moreover, some of this brunt of sexism and gender identity is coming down on trans people. They're taking the brunt of it. As we move forward towards equality, gender equality, parity, breaking out of the binary, transgender people are taking the biggest hit of it all. And we have to think as allies, how can we shoulder some of that burden? Like Gavin Newsom burden took it on for us with being the big brother and being like, I'll take on all the Democrats that are giving me crap about this. You guys just go get married. Like, we need to be that for our trans ally, for our trans folks and family members.
I just wanted to pull one other thing out of
Yeah.
Max's question. It's not necessarily an answer, but I also think that there's something important about thinking about like regional difference and LGBT politics, and that there is something right around like a lot of anti-trans legislation in particular happens at the state level. and that there does need to be a more engaged way that like people, for example, in California or New York or Massachusetts, right, like are actually not just like writing off the rest of the country, but are actually thinking about ways to support organizing that happens in places where these sort of more conservative bills are being passed so quickly, right? So, you know, I think that really trying to think through some of the regional differences of experience and how do we like actually combat legislation at a state level is an important part of that question.
And there's nothing it did more to sort of professionalize the state level LGBT political advocacy apparatus as the marriage campaigns did, and part of that is that the fallout of 2004. I mean, the short version of the 2004 story is what we're talking about in San Francisco and elsewhere happens in February 2004. Bush endorsed the federal marriage amendment. It fails or it doesn't get a supermajority in the Senate. And a lot of that effort that had been devoted to passing a federal marriage amendment gets redirected to 13 states that put amendments on their ballots that fall. All of them pass banning same-sex marriage in the states, and a cluster of donors, almost all wealthy, cis white gay men, who prioritize marriage above any of the other sort of community or movement priorities, decide that they want to respond to this by investing heavily. Tim Gill is the most famous and the biggest giver of them, but there's a cluster of 6 or 7 big donors and a lot of smaller donors who care about marriage above anything else. And their money over the next 5 to 7 years builds a state level political capacity that in many places in the country, in all but maybe 5 or 6 states, had never existed. Funds a lot of research into organizing best practices, into messaging research, a lot of practical stuff, data sharing infrastructure, all of that. That wouldn't have happened if marriage hadn't been at the top of the agenda, and that is an infrastructure that now exists to be tapped for causes other than marriage. And so that's one way to answer Maxwell's question, that there is a very practical sort of residue of the marriage fight that can be deployed. I think one of the big questions is whether that cluster of donors who cared a lot about marriage out of self-interest because they care about estate planning, and there is no other way to get around the estate tax, whether they will be in a sustained way interested in supporting, trans issues or other issues of concern to different parts of the LGBT coalition.
Let me end this with a question from someone who did not give their name. It is fundamental that all people, queer or straight, must have the same legal rights. Since marriage is an option for straight people, it must also be available to queer people. With that as a starting point, there is much work to be done for our social structures. Do we indeed need the institution of marriage? Should healthcare be tied to employment and/or marriage? And what about other equality issues unrelated to marriage? For example, true equality for people of color and people with disabilities. To distill this question, must this be a zero-sum game? Does a larger piece of pie for one cause necessarily mean a smaller piece of pie for another cause? Do these movements within the LGBTQ community have to exist in opposition to one another, where the fight for marriage must necessarily exclude the other movements, the fights this person mentioned in the question? Is it possible to see this as something other than a tug of war over limited resources?
Well, I'll just say that the proof is in the pudding, right? LGBT organizations that were not working on marriage closed, right? QEJ is no longer with us.
Well, then you're saying it was a tug of war. I'm saying, is there a way to do it that's not? Is there a way to do it that is inclusive and expansive and uplifting, or is that naive?
Well, of course, there's a way, but the question is whether the resources are there, whether to fund certain kinds of work.
And what would that look like? What would an inclusive, expansive, non-tug of war version of this movement look like?
Well, I don't know that there's a such thing as a movement that doesn't have a tug of war.
Mm.
So several propositions, like several levels of this conversation, I don't.
And so you're saying that it's a fantasy, it's naive?
Yeah, to that extent. But if you but I what I can say is that do I think that there are other sort of fights that have significant impact on queer and trans people that I think that are not just LGBT folks, you know, kind of centered in a same-sex marriage frame? Absolutely. Right. So the part of the original question was about and again, I work in public health, so I think a lot about the loss of a focus on, you know, a single payer or Medicare for all, whatever kind of health system, which in a lot of countries that ended up, you know, doing same-sex marriage, that was already in place in most places, right? Before they even made that option, so that nobody in a lot of countries was needed a partner in order to get their health benefits taken care of. And I think like I'll take that as one issue that I think does have far-reaching impact, that has significant impact on the lives of queer and trans folks, but also touches a range of other communities and identities as well.
We're just about out of time, and now we'll return to Tina Sachs for closing remarks.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm just really, really impressed. I'm really glad that we were able to, you know, chop it up in this way. And with that, we will say goodbye.
Oh.
Thank you.